The noodles were cold before I even picked up the fork. That was the thing nobody tells you about working in the Joint Interstellar Response Division. It was not the long hours, it was not the impossible decisions or the weight of a commission that covered 32 recognized species and God knows how many unrecognized ones. It was the cold food. You sat down to eat, something screamed across the board, and by the time you looked up again, the noodles had turned into a sad, clumped mass that tasted like regret and recycled station air. I was on my third attempt at lunch when the signal came in. My name is Yale Oduya, Commander, UNISC Joint Interstellar Response Division, Earth. Orbital Station Meridian. I had been doing this job for 11 years. I had processed 742 distress calls in that time. I remembered with uncomfortable precision the exact texture of the food I had been eating during each of the bad ones. The signal came in at 14:07 station time. I remember because I had just checked the clock thinking I might actually finish eating before the shift ended. The intake board flagged it as a Tier 3 diplomatic inquiry. That was the lowest possible urgency classification. Below Tier 3 was basically someone asking for a weather report. My junior analyst, a man named Owen Carr, whose entire career ambition appeared to be sitting as still as possible while things happened around him, transferred it to my terminal with a note that read Hari. Colony situation. They used the word difficulties, recommend standard humanitarian convoy assessment. He had also, I noticed, already started filling out the convoy requisition form. 3. Ship's standard medical corps, water filtration units, 200 tons of emergency food rations. Owen was efficient. Owen was thorough. Owen had the instincts of a filing cabinet. I pulled the raw feed, not the diplomatic summary, not Owen's tidy requisition form, the raw transmission data from Turth 9, the Velhari colony in question, sitting at the edge of the KTH Dominion's expansion corridor like a coin left on a railroad track. Turth 9 had a population of 37 million. It was a quiet colony, agricultural mostly. The Velhari were a quiet species in general. They communicated in long layered sentences full of qualifications and courtesies. They did not shout. They did not make demands. Their diplomatic language had 17 different words for patience and only one word for emergency, and even that one word was surrounded grammatically by apologies. The raw data took 40 seconds to pull. I sat there eating cold noodles while it loaded. The atmospheric composition report came up first. Carbon content elevated by 600% above baseline. Ash particulate present throughout the lower stratosphere. Thermal signatures consistent with large-scale structural combustion across 7 of the colonies. 9 major urban centers, the kind of numbers you get when cities stop being cities. I put the fork down. I pulled the communication logs next. Turth 9 had been broadcasting on standard Velhari frequencies up until 19 hours ago. The last transmission was a routine agricultural output report, crop yields, rainfall measurements, a note about a local festival scheduled for the following week, then silence. Not the silence of a transmitter going offline, not the silence of a communication blackout, the silence that I had learned over 11 years in 742 cases to recognize the way a doctor recognizes A particular kind of stillness in a patient, the silence that comes after a world stops having things to say. I looked at Owen's requisition form on my secondary screen. 3 ships medical. Core water filtration, 200 tons of food. I closed it without submitting it. There was a second piece of data buried in the transmission metadata. It almost went unnoticed because it was sandwiched between crop yield tables and atmospheric sensor readings, tucked in like a folded note slipped under a door. It was a fragment of an internal Velhari communication not meant for external recipients, captured by our relay satellites and auto-rated. I read it 3 times. It said we did not ask the humans, because humans grieve loudly and act slowly. I sat with that for a moment. The station hummed around me. Down the hall, someone was laughing at something. The ventilation system made its usual sound, like a large animal breathing through its nose. Owen was typing with 2 fingers very carefully, the way he did when he was pretending to be busy. I thought about the atmospheric data, 600%. Carbon, 7 cities. I thought about 37 million people and a festival that was not going to happen. I thought about the K-Dominion, whose expansion corridor had been pressing against Velhari colonial space for the better part of a decade, and whose diplomatic communications I had read enough of to know that they had a word in their language that translated roughly as creatures who have not yet understood that they are small. They used it for humans. They used it for a lot of species. I pushed back from my desk. I walked to the window. Below the station, Earth turned at its usual pace, doing the thing it had always done, entirely unbothered by the fact that I was in the middle of making a decision that was going to cost someone a great deal. I just had not decided yet who. I went back to my terminal. I did not open Owen's form. I opened a different screen, a contact directory that did not officially exist under my divisions. Operational resources, numbers that were not in the standard UNISC database. Frequencies that ran on channels technically reserved for exercises and drills. I started making calls. First one was to a man named Callum Price, who commanded the carrier group, currently running a training exercise in the Proxima deployment zone. I had served with Callum for 6 years. He owed me a favor from an incident involving a misfiled report and a diplomatic situation that had almost ended 3 careers. He picked up on the second signal. I said, pull your group out of the exercise. I will explain in 20 minutes. Start movement protocols now. He said, how many ships? I said, all of them. He did not ask any more questions. Callum was good at reading silence. The second call was to Fleet Admiral Dorinda Nwaku, who was in the middle of a budget review and sounded exactly as thrilled about my interruption as one might expect. I gave her the atmospheric data. I read her the metadata fragment. I told her what I was doing. She was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said, you understand that this bypasses every standard protocol for Tier 3 assessments? I said, yes, Admiral. She said, you understand that if you are wrong, or if this is interpreted as an unsanctioned escalation, the diplomatic consequences alone will take years to untangle. I said, yes, Admiral. She said, you understand I am going to need at least the appearance of proper authorization before I can move fleet assets. I said, I will have the paperwork on your terminal in 10 minutes. Another Silence shorter this time, she said. Make it 8. The third call was to Commander Felix Hartley, who ran the UNISC logistics arm and had the organizational capacity of a man who genuinely enjoyed spreadsheets the way some people enjoyed music. I told him I needed full mobilization staging for a Tier 1 active intervention. I told him 48 hours was the window. He laughed, not cry, just the laugh of a man who thought he was hearing a joke. Then he pulled up the atmospheric data I was transmitting to his screen. He stopped laughing. He said, I will need to pull from 3 separate staging depots. I said, pull from 6. He said, that will flag every automated budget alert in the division. I said, good. It would mean the decision was already made before anyone senior enough to reverse it had time to read their morning alerts. That was the thing about institutions. They moved slowly when they were being polite. They moved like water when the pipes were already full. I made 9 more calls in the next 40 minutes. I did not eat the noodles. I did not think about eating them. I moved through the list with a particular kind of focus that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with the cold arithmetic clarity that settles when a decision has already been made somewhere below conscious thought, and the rest of you is just catching up. Last call was not to anyone in the military. It was to a woman named Helen Cross, who worked in the UNISC Legal Documentation Division and was the best person alive at writing orders that were technically compliant with every regulation while also being in practical terms a sledgehammer wrapped in paperwork. I told her what I needed. She said, timeline. I said the paperwork needs to exist before the ships reach the jump point. She said, you are asking me to write a legal framework for an operation that has already started. I said, I am asking you to write it very well. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, you know what they thought of us in that transmission? I had forwarded it to her as context. I said, yes. She said that we grieve loudly and act slowly. I said, yes. She said, well, let us make sure that documentation is thorough. I went back to my desk. The noodles were still their cold, congealed past any reasonable point of consumption. I ate them anyway, not because I was hungry, because somewhere between the atmospheric data and the 9th phone call, I had decided that the only way forward was to stay very ordinary about this, to keep eating lunch, to keep filing papers, to do the loudest, most overwhelming thing in the history of Valhari colonial relations with the calm administrative focus of a woman processing a Tier 3 inquiry. That was the thing about grief I had learned, the kind that had already done its work in you, the kind that lived in the marrow and not the throat. It did not make you loud, it made you organized. 48 hours. I thought 48 hours in the Keth Dominion was going to learn something new about humans, something that would not fit in any of the words they currently had for us. I started writing the after-action report. I always wrote it before the action. It kept me honest. Outside the station window, Earth kept turning, unbothered, eternal, entirely unaware that 41 ships, then 60, then carrier groups whose names sounded like promises kept in the dark, were already beginning to move. The Valhari orbital station above Turth 9 was not built for silence, but it had learned to accommodate it, as Savath had been the diplomatic at the station for 6 years he was a careful man, careful, in the way that only someone who had watched an empire's expansion corridor inch toward his people's colonies for a decade could be careful. He had developed over those 6 years a particular habit of standing at the observation window when he needed to think. The window faced away from Tarth, 9 away from the ash-gold smear in the atmosphere that he had stopped letting himself look at too directly. It faced deep space instead, clean and empty and honest. He had received the human notification that morning. It had come through standard diplomatic channels, filed under relief assets incoming, which was the lowest possible category of flagged correspondence. His assistant, a young Velhari named Reth, had printed it and left it on his desk with a small note: human convoy 3 ships ETA 48 hours, landing pad 4 cleared and ready. As Savathresh had read it, nodded and asked Reth to prepare intake processing for the incoming medical teams. That had been 6 hours ago. Now he stood at the observation window, and the space in front of him was doing something that space was not supposed to do. It was getting crowded. The first jump signature appeared at 9:14. Savathresh saw the light bloom of it from the window, the brief shimmer of a vessel dropping out of faster than light transit, and thought nothing of it. Vessels arrived at the station constantly, even now, even with what had happened below. Cargo transports and medical ships were threading in and out. But then Reth's voice came from the doorway, quiet, very controlled. Sir, we have a second jump signature. As Savather turned from the window, then a third. Reth said his voice was doing a thing that Velhari voices did when the speaker was working hard to remain professional. A slight flattening, a compression of tone, like a wall going up as Savathresh walked to the monitoring station. 4th said a different analyst, then a 5th, then the man tracking jump coordinates simply stopped calling out individual numbers and said, "I am reading a cluster formation," and his voice had gone the color of a man who had realized the word cluster was no longer adequate. As Savath looked at the display, 7 ships had arrived in the time it had taken him to walk from the window to the monitoring station. He watched the 8th appear, the 9th. The signatures were coming in at intervals of roughly 90 seconds each, spaced with a regularity that felt less like accident and more like intent, like something being assembled piece by piece. In plain sight, he stood very still. Reth appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, the incoming vessels are broadcasting UNISC military identification." He paused. "All of them?" as Savathresh said. "How many is all of them?" Reth looked at his data screen. "As of this moment, 19, but the signatures are still coming." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has simultaneously decided to stop doing whatever they were doing and pay attention to one specific thing. Analysts who had been filing reports were not filing anymore. Technicians who had been running routine maintenance checks had their hands still on their boards. Everyone was watching the display. 23 ships, someone said, then 28. Essa had a memory sudden and unbidden from his childhood. A coastal town, a tide that had gone out farther than it was supposed to go, pulling back from the shore with unusual and frightening obedience, leaving wet sand and stranded fish and a strange, loud silence. He remembered standing on the shore with his feet in the retreating water, watching the horizon. He remembered what had come next. 34 ships, Reth said. His voice had lost its professional compression entirely. He sounded like someone reading a number that refused to mean what numbers were supposed to mean. As Savathresh turned to his communications officer, a woman named Dava, who was already looking at him with the expression of someone waiting for an instruction that would make sense of what she was seeing, he said, "Get me a visual on the leading vessels." The main display shifted from a signal schematic to a direct visual feed, captured by the station's long-range optical array. The image showed a section of space that had 40 minutes ago been empty. It was not empty now, it was occupied by ships arranged in a formation so deliberate it looked like geometry, like someone had sat down with a very large piece of paper and drawn exactly where everything should go. Ships were big, not in the way that cargo freighters were big, the clumsy, functional bulk of vessels designed to carry as much as possible between 2 points. These were big in the way that things are big when size is a message, when the dimensions of a thing are specifically intended to communicate something to anyone looking at it. 39, said the analyst at the jump tracker. Then 41. Reth said very carefully, "Sir, I need to reclassify the incoming relief assets." As Savathresh did not answer him, he was watching the display. Specifically, he was watching a vessel that had just completed its transit and was now holding position at the forward edge of the formation. It was longer than the Velhari orbital station, considerably longer. It carried along its flanks the kind of weapon arrays that were not installed on ships that expected to use them as a deterrent. 47 ships, said the jump tracker. Then he stopped calling out numbers for a moment, because 3 signatures appeared simultaneously and then 4 more in rapid succession, and he was doing the math with a visible urgency. Davis said, "Commander, I am receiving a standard courtesy transmission from the leading human vessel. It is filed under relief coordination." As Savath looked at her, "Read it," he said. She read it. Her voice was steady. She was better at professional flatness than wrath. She said, "This is Commander Yale Oduya, UNISC Joint Interstellar Response Division. We have completed our intake assessment of your situation. We have upgraded your request from Tier 2 relief to Tier 1 active intervention. Please advise the Keth Dominion to begin withdrawal within 6 hours. Standard courtesy window." The room was extremely quiet as Savathresh became aware that he was gripping the edge of the monitoring station with both hands and had been for some time. He released it. 53 ships, said the jump tracker with the voice of a man who had simply decided to stop being surprised by the numbers and just report them. As Savath looked at Reth, "What classification should I file the incoming fleet under?" Reth asked. He was holding a data tablet and a stylus and looking at Savathresh with genuine helplessness. The existing categories in his filing system were things like medical convoy, logistical support, diplomatic escort. None of them had a field for this. As Savathresh looked back at the display, the vessel he had been watching, the long one, had shifted its position just slightly. The movement was unhurried. It was the movement of something very large that knew it did not need to rush beside it, in the formation that kept growing as new jump signatures kept appearing. Other vessels held their positions with the same unhurried certainty. The Whole arrangement had a quality he found. Difficult to name, not aggressive. Exactly. Not threatening in the way that things were threatening when they wanted to make you feel afraid. More like a door being opened very wide, very calmly by someone who had decided, without drama, that the door had been closed long enough. 61 ships, said the jump tracker. He had stopped adding inflection to the numbers entirely. He said it the way a man reads a weather report in a city where the weather has been extreme for so long that the extremity has become the baseline. File it under mistake, Esava Thresh said. Reth looked up from his tablet. Esava Thresh was still looking at the display. Hours, he said. Davis said from her station, the KE Dominion's nearest patrol group has gone to active alert status. They are broadcasting on the standard frequency, requesting the human fleet to identify itself. Savath Thresh thought about the response to that and decided he already knew what it would be. He thought about the 6-hour courtesy window in Commander Oduya's transmission. He thought about what a courtesy window meant when it came attached to 61 ships and a vessel that was longer than some moons. It meant exactly what it said. It was a courtesy. The window was real. 6 hours were 6 hours. No games, no hidden timeline, no manufactured urgency. That was the part that was going to be difficult to explain to the K Dominion, he thought. They were accustomed to posturing. They were accustomed to fleets that arrived with overwhelming numbers and then spent the next 2 weeks in long procedural negotiations, during which the overwhelming numbers slowly redistributed and deals were made, and everything reached an arrangement that the larger party had intended from the beginning. What they were not accustomed to was a commander who sent a transmission filed under relief coordination, gave a genuine 6-hour window out of what appeared to be basic professional courtesy, and then went back to doing paperwork while 61 ships held formation in perfect geometric silence. There was nothing to negotiate around. There was just a deadline. 67 ships, said the jump tracker. Then he paused. He looked at his readout. He looked at it for a moment longer than a readout usually required. Sir, he said to Esava Thresh, the carrier groups have begun arriving. As Savath Thresh turned back to the window, the one that faced deep space, the clean, empty, honest one. It was not empty now either. The carrier groups were a different category of vessel, not just in size. Though the size was significant, they were different in the way that context changes meaning. Everything that had arrived before them, the 67 ships of the primary fleet, had been in isolation. Explicable, a strong response in overwhelming response perhaps, but explicable. The carrier groups changed the explanation. They arrived in pairs, dropping out of transit in a sequence that felt choreographed because it was. Each carrier was flanked by 2 escort ships and trailed by a supply chain of vessels whose purpose was clearly not combat. Hospital ships, fuel tenders, engineering platforms, the kind of support infrastructure that was not assembled for a show of force. It was assembled for a sustained presence. They were not here to make a point. They were here to stay until the point was no longer necessary. Reth appeared beside him again. He had abandoned the tablet. He said quietly, "They came in 48 hours, as Savath said." "Yes," Reth said. "We sent a tier 3 inquiry As Savath said, I know, Reth was quiet. For a moment, then he said, we said. They acted slowly, the observation. Window was full of ships now, full in a way that windows were not supposed to be. Full, there were silhouettes where there had been stars, the light in the room was subtly different because of it, not darker exactly, more occupied. Savathresh thought about that internal fragment that had been included accidentally in their original transmission. The fragment that he had not known was captured, that the humans had read, that it said plainly in the bureaucratic language of Velhari intercolonial communication that they had not asked humanity for help because they expected humanity to be loud and slow. He was not sure, standing at the window looking at the fleet, which part of that had been more wrong, the loud part. He decided that had been the more wrong part. Commander Oduya's transmission had been 4 sentences, filed under relief coordination, delivered in the tone of someone nodding. A schedule change. The ships were loud enough on their own. He straightened up. He turned to Dava. Send in acknowledgement to Commander Oduya, he said, standard diplomatic format. Tell her that the Velhari Confederation is grateful for the upgraded response classification. Dava said in the 6-hour window as Savath said, tell her we have noted it. He walked back to his desk. He picked up the notification that Reth had printed that morning. Human convoy. 3 ships, ETA 48 hours, landing pad 4. Cleared and ready. He folded it once. He set it down. He sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a man who has just understood something that cannot be understood, and looked at the window where the ships were and thought about the tide, about how it had gone out very far, about how he had stood on the shore as a child with his feet in the retreating water and watched the horizon. He had been afraid then. He looked at the ships. He was not afraid. Now, he picked up his communication terminal and began drafting a new message to the KAT Dominion's diplomatic channel. The message was by Velhari standards, extremely brief. It said, we recommend you read your messages from the human fleet carefully. It said, particularly the part about the window. It said, we believe they mean it literally. He sent it before he could second-guess the directness of it. Then he sat back and listened to the station. Around him, the hum of systems, the quiet voices of his staff beginning to move again after the long stillness, the distant sound of a ship's engine as something very large adjusted its position outside the window. Somewhere in the fleet, Commander Oduya was probably eating cold noodles. He had feeling she did not mind. The KTH Dominion's response arrived 4 minutes and 17 seconds after Commander Oduya's transmission was sent. 4 minutes. She had allowed them 6 hours. I was at my station on the bridge of the UNISC Ardent when the response came through. The Ardent was my flagship, which was a word I used in my head only very occasionally because it felt too large and too certain, like a coat that did not quite belong to me yet, but it was mine. 11 decks, a crew of 412. Enough firepower in its forward arrays to have a very serious conversation with. Most things in known space. I was eating a nutrition bar because someone had pointed out to me, not unkindly, that I had not eaten anything since the cold noodles at Meridian Station 43 hours ago. The response from the Keth Dominion came through on the standard diplomatic frequency. My communications officer, a young man named Callum Price's former protege named Ellis Grant had it on my secondary screen before I had finished. Chewing, I read it. It was long. Key diplomatic correspondence was always long, layered with formal structure, cross-referenced with legal codes from their Dominion Charter and written in a style that communicated in every grammatical choice the senders complete confidence in their own authority. The auto-translation caught the tone well. It read like a letter written by someone who had never in their life received a letter that contradicted them. The summary was this: the human fleet had no legal standing in Kethalhari territorial matters. The presence of UNISC military assets constituted an unsanctioned incursion. The K-Dominion demanded immediate withdrawal. Failure to comply would result in the human fleet being classified as hostile combatants, and in a final paragraph that I read twice, because I wanted to make sure the translation was accurate, there was a sentence that called the human response disproportionate and emotionally motivated. Ellis Grant was looking at me from his station. I finished the nutrition bar. I put the wrapper in my desk drawer because I was on the bridge, and that was where it would stay until I had time to deal with it properly. Then I opened a new document and typed 3 words into it: received, noted, filed. I saved the document with a timestamp and added it to the folder that already contained the atmospheric data, the metadata fragment about humans grieving loudly, and the movement logs of every KE vessel that had been operating in Turth 9's orbit for the past 72 hours. Grant said, "Commander, how would you like to respond?" I said, "Officially or to the whole fleet?" He paused. "Both, I suppose, sir." I said, "Officially, send a standard acknowledgement. Tell them their message has been received and logged. Tell them the 6-hour window stands. Tell them we are updating their file." Grant typed. Then he said, "And to the fleet." I thought about it for a moment. The fleet was not just the Ardent. The fleet was 67 vessels and 4 carrier groups and enough combined personnel to populate a small city. They had all shipped out in 48 hours. They had pulled from exercises, from staging depots, from leave cycles that I had interrupted with phone calls that started with "Remember what you owe me." They were here because the numbers in an atmospheric report said that 37 million people had not had time to send anything louder than a crop yield report before the silence came in. I said to Grant, "Tell them we have 6 hours. Tell them to use it the way I told them to use it." He said it the way I had told them to use it was this: document everything. Not prepare, not stage, not run targeting calculations or plot approach vectors, though all of that was being done carefully and thoroughly by people whose entire training was the careful and thorough doing of such things. But the first 6 hours were for something different, for bearing witness, for making an official, time-stamped, legally unimpeachable record of everything the KT Dominion had done and everything they were doing. Now I had learned this years ago from a woman named Deputy Director Lena Marsh of the UNISC Legal Affairs Division, who had told me once in a corridor outside a very long meeting that the most powerful thing you can do before a conflict is make sure history knows exactly what started it and why. The fleet spread out, not aggressively, not in an encircling formation or a combat spread, in a pattern that looked on a tactical display like a scientific survey, ships moving to optimal sensor positions, Long-range arrays coming online. Atmospheric probes dropping into Earth. 9's upper stratosphere and sending back data that was timestamped by UNISC. Chronometers and filed in real time with Meridian Station, Earth Orbital Command, and 3 separate civilian archive databases whose entire purpose was to make information permanent. I put on my headset and started dictating. I described what I was seeing. I described the damaged signatures on Earth. 9's surface. I described the KET fleet. Disposition, 23 warships holding position above the colony, 7 of them in active combat configuration with weapon arrays deployed rather than docked. I described the Vilhari survivor vessels clustered at the edge of KE patrol range, sitting in a tight group, like children standing very still, hopping not to be noticed. I described a transport ship bearing Vilhari colony, registration codes that was sitting dark and cold and alone about 40,000 km from the main survivor group, too far out to reach by any reasonable assessment. Its transponder broadcasting on emergency frequencies that no one in the K fleet appeared to be answering. I noted the time, I noted the coordinates, I flagged it. Hour 2, the Kef fleet had not moved significantly. Their patrol patterns continued. Their communications, which we were monitoring on every available frequency, were operational and professional and entirely unconcerned with the human fleet holding position 1,200 km outside their perimeter. This I thought was interesting, not alarming, interesting. It told me something about how they had categorized us. We were, in their estimation, a nuisance, a political problem to be managed through diplomatic pressure, perhaps a card to be played in a later negotiation, but not a threat. Not something that required the kind of internal response that would show up in communication traffic as changed patrol patterns, repositioned assets, updated engagement protocols. They thought we were loud and slow. They thought we had come to stand very impressively at the edge of their operational area until someone on Earth got nervous about the diplomatic fallout and recalled the fleet. They thought the 6-hour window was theater. I went back to dictating. Hour 3, Ellis Grant brought me something that his counterpart on the carrier Pharaoh had flagged. A communication from a KE patrol vessel to its fleet command, intercepted and translated. In it, the patrol vessel's commanding officer described the human fleet formation as excessive sentiment in the shape of military hardware. I read that twice also. I saved it to the folder excessive sentiment. I had to think about that for a moment, not because it was inaccurate in a way that surprised me, but because of which part was inaccurate. The sentiment part. I supposed that was the part they had wrong. What I had was not sentiment. Sentiment was warm and present tense, the kind of feeling that lived in the chest and made decisions poorly. What I had was older than that, quieter, the kind of thing that lives in the structure of you after enough years and enough atmospheric reports and enough cold noodles eaten at desks where you are trying every day to do the math on what is worth what. The Cath had been absorbing species for 300 years. They were very good at reading the emotional register of a threat. They had just never been very good at reading ours. Hour 4, the flag transport ship, the one sitting dark and alone at the edge of KE patrol range, sent a new transmission on its emergency frequency. It was weak, barely above threshold, but we caught it. It was a Vilhari colony. Registration vessel. It carried, according to its manifest, a crew of 8 and a passenger list of 409. Most of the passengers were listed in the flat terminology of colonial transport records as minors. The life support readings coming off the vessel's passive sensors were at 11% of baseline capacity. I read that number and then I sat with it for a moment. 11%, not a dramatic number, not a number that announced itself, just a number sitting there on a screen in the same font as all the other numbers, requiring no particular reaction, offering no commentary on itself. I looked at the KE patrol vessel nearest to the transport. I looked at the vectors on the tactical display. The patrol vessel had seen the transport's emergency transmissions. It was in fact moving, just not toward the transport. Grant looked at me. I looked at the clock. 3 hours and 43 minutes left in the courtesy window. There was a particular kind of decision that was not really a decision at all, because every path through it led to the same place. And the only question was how long you spent standing at the door before you went through it. I had been standing at this one since the noodles went cold at Meridian Station. I said, Grant, update the fleet. He said, updated. Commander, I said, tell them the window is closed. He looked at me. It had been 4 hours and 17 minutes. I said, they made their choice. We made our courtesy. Grant sent the fleet update. His hands were very steady. I appreciated that about him. He had the hands of someone who had decided that whatever was in front of him was worth steady hands. On the display, the fleet began to move. Not rushing, not with the chaotic burst of something acting on emotion. The movement was smooth and deliberate and exactly as well coordinated as 67 vessels and 4 carrier groups crewed by people who had been talking to each other constantly for 48 hours and knew each other's operational rhythms, the way musicians know a piece they have rehearsed until it lives in the fingers. I dictated the time. I dictated the justification. I noted the life support status of the Vilhari transport and the movement of the KE patrol vessel and the 4 hours and 17 minutes of courtesy that had been offered in good faith. I closed the dictation log. I said to Grant, get me the Keth Fleet command on the open channel. He opened it. I said, this is Commander Yale Oduya of the UNISC Joint Interstellar Response Division. You were given 6 hours. You had 4 hours and 17 minutes. I paused for exactly 1 second. I said, we are updating your file. Then I said, Grant, close the channel. He closed it. The fleet was already moving through the geometry. It had spent 4 hours rehearsing in sensor positions and survey patterns, sliding into the shapes that the tactical planning division had mapped during the transit from Earth, smooth and certain and entirely unhurried, because there was no need to hurry. Everything was already where it needed to be. I picked up the folder, the one with all the documentation, the atmospheric data, the metadata fragment, the KET dominions response, the intercepted message about excessive sentiment, the life support number, all of it timestamped, archived, filed with 3 separate databases, legally unimpeachable and permanently recorded. I set it on the corner of my desk where I would remember to send the final version to Helen Cross when this was done. She would want the paperwork to be complete, outside the Arden's viewport. The fleet moved, behind us Tirth 9. Turned slowly in its orbit, below the ash-gold smear of its atmosphere, 37 million people had a festival they had not been able to hold yet. I was going to make sure they got the chance. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. What happened was not glorious. I have read since that day accounts that describe what the UNISC fleet did above Tirth 9 in terms that involve words like triumphant and overwhelming and decisive. Those words are accurate. They are also not the point. The point is never in the words that make it sound like the subject of a mural. The point is always in the smaller things, the ones that the accounts leave out because they are hard to render in the language of official records. So I am going to tell you about those. I am going to tell you that my junior systems officer, a man named Dale Porter, who was 26 years old and had a photograph of his dog taped to the inside of his console panel, was eating an apple when the first engagement began, slowly, methodically, just eating an apple with the focused attention of someone who had decided that eating an apple was the thing they were going to do right now, regardless of what the tactical display was showing. I noticed it and I did not say anything about it because I understood it immediately. Dale Porter was eating an apple because Dale Porter's hands needed something to do that was not connected to the thing his hands were trained to do, and an apple was a reasonable solution to that problem. I understood that completely. The engagement had a shape to it that I had planned for but had not entirely predicted. What I had planned for was the Keth Dominion's fleet, 23 warships, responding to the UNISC fleet advance with the tactical protocols of an empire that had absorbed 14 species and learned from each one. What I had predicted was organized resistance, a coordinated defensive formation, a response calibrated to the threat. What actually happened was different. The first 3K vessels went to combat configuration exactly as expected. Their weapon arrays deployed, their shields came up, their patrol patterns collapsed into a defensive cluster around the KE command ship, so far entirely predicted. Then they transmitted on the open channel their fleet voice, a rank that translated roughly as the officer who speaks so others do not have to, reached out on an open frequency and said something. The auto translation took about 8 seconds, which was long for a short transmission, and when it came through, Ellis Grant had to read it to me twice because the first time I was not sure the translation was correct. It said, "What are you?" Not a threat, not a counter demand, not a legal citation or a territorial assertion. "What are you?" 3 words on an open military channel in the middle of what was on any tactical display, clearly an active engagement. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about what that question meant, coming from an empire that had classified humanity as creatures who have not yet understood that they are small. I thought about what it meant that they were asking it now in this moment, in this configuration of their fleet. It meant they had looked at what was happening and found that none of their existing categories fit. The thing they had expected was a loud, emotionally motivated response, a fleet that arrived with anger and noise and the particular kind of tactical sloppiness that comes from acting before thinking, a fleet that could be stalled with diplomacy and eventually redirected with the right combination of threats and concessions. What they were watching instead was something they did not have a name for. The UNISC fleet was talking constantly. I want to be specific about this because it was the part that seemed to unsettle the KE more than any other single element. Our internal communications were open, not encrypted, not procedurally formal, across 67 ships and 4 carrier groups, 412 people on my ship alone. There was a constant stream of chatter, technical confirmations, and position updates, and the kind of sentence fragment shorthand that people develop when they have worked together long enough that full sentences feel redundant, but mixed in with all of it running through it like a thread was the other kind of communication. Jokes, references to things that had nothing to do with what was happening. Someone on the carrier Pharaoh said something about a television program. Someone on the destroyer line responded with what was apparently a follow-up joke about the same program. Laughter was audible on a shared channel. 400 ships in an act of engagement. Laughter. The KTH did not understand what they were looking at. Their 14 absorbed species had given them a sophisticated model of how sentient beings behaved under pressure. That model did not include laughter. That model did not include a fleet that communicated like a family at a loud dinner table while simultaneously executing geometric formations with the precision of something that had been rehearsing this specific moment for its entire existence. What we were was what we had always been. We were people who were very good at being scared and doing the thing anyway. We were people who had learned across a history so long and so thoroughly furnished with difficulty that it had become the wallpaper of our species, that the only way to do the hard thing was to keep talking to each other while you did it, to keep being human while you did it, to eat the apple and make the joke and send the stupid reference to the television program on the shared channel, because those things were not distractions from the work. They were the reason for the work. They were the thing that the work was protecting. The Keth Fleet voice asked what we were. I did not answer the transmission, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer was already visible if you knew how to look at it. It was in the formation, in the laughter in Dale Porter's apple, and the photograph of his dog, and the 412 people on my ship who had shipped out in 48 hours because an atmospheric report said that 37 million people had gone quiet. It was in the folder on the corner of my desk. The engagement itself took 3 hours and 11 minutes from the first contact to the moment the KE flagship went dark. I am not going to describe it in tactical terms because the tactical terms are in the after-action report, and the after-action report is a matter of official record. What I will tell you is that for the majority of those 3 hours and 11 minutes I was dictating continuously, while the tactical display showed me exactly what the fleet was doing. I described it, timestamped it, added it to the folder, the positions of the KE vessels, the moments when their formation shifted, the 3 times they attempted to break through the outer perimeter line in the direction of the survivor cluster, and the 3 times the outer perimeter line held without giving back a centimeter, the exact moment 2 hours and 44 minutes in when the lights on the KE flagship changed. In KE visual communication, on board, lighting served a ceremonial as well as a functional purpose. The colors carried meaning. Blue lighting indicated active operational status. It was what a KE vessel showed when it was engaged and confident and certain of its course. The flagship's lights changed from blue to red. In the KE cultural vocabulary, red was the color of the moment. A commander understood they had made an error they could not correct. It was not a surrender signal. It was something more interior than that. It was a color that existed to acknowledge to whoever was watching that the person inside had looked at everything available to them and arrived at an honest conclusion. Ellis Grant said quietly, "Their flagship has changed lighting configuration." I noted it, timestamped it, added it to the folder. Dale Porter had finished the apple. He was holding the core carefully, not wanting to put it down a way that made any noise. I noticed that, and I thought about it for a second. The care he was taking, the small, ordinary human fidiousness of not wanting to be the person who dropped an apple core on the bridge floor during an engagement. We were people who cared about things like that. We were people who ate apples and told jokes and cared about not making a mess on the bridge floor while simultaneously doing something that an empire of 14 absorbed species did not have a word for. That was the answer to the Fleet Voix question. That was what we were. At 3 hours and 11 minutes, the KE flagship went dark, not destroyed. Its systems were operational. Its crew was operational. It went dark in the specific way that a KE vessel went dark when it had decided to stop doing the thing it was doing, not surrender. The KE did not have a straightforward word for surrender in a military context because their military history had not produced many situations that required one. What they had instead was a gesture, a recognized behavior developed over 300 years of absorbing species for the moment when a K commander encountered something that had stepped outside the boundaries of what could be categorized, responded to, or overcome with available resources. They lowered their weapons, not metaphorically, the weapon arrays physically folded back into the dock position. The shields came down. The active combat configuration on every one of the 23K vessels that were still fully operational reverted to standard cruise status. The KE had encountered something they could not categorize. They were doing what their culture had taught them to do in that situation. They were waiting. The bridge of the Ardent was very quiet for a moment. The constant channel chatter that had been running through the engagement had gone down to a low hum, not silent but soft, the way it got when everyone was processing the same information at the same time and needed a second before the joke started again. Dale Porter looked at me. I was already writing the after-action report. I had most of it done already since I had been dictating for 3 hours and 11 minutes, but the closing section was the part I had written first before we left Earth, and I needed to check it against what had actually happened to confirm that it was still accurate. It was I added the timestamp for the KE weapon lowering. I added the lighting change. I added the fleet voices question and the fact that I had not answered it, and I added a note in the margin that the question itself was significant and should be included in the formal assessment submitted to the diplomatic division. Grant said, "Commander, the Velhari transport is requesting permission to move toward the survivor cluster." I said, "Granted, and get a medical team from the Pharaoh out there now, not in 30 minutes now, he sent the order. I looked at the tactical display, 23K. Vessels, weapons down, lights changed. Waiting, 67 UNISC vessels, 4 carrier. Groups still in formation, also waiting. But in the way that things wait when they have already decided what they are going to do next and are simply giving the other party a reasonable moment to understand the situation. There was a difference between those two kinds of waiting. The KE were beginning to understand what the difference was. I picked up my dictation log and added one more note. I noted that the Apple core was still sitting on the corner of Dale Porter's console and that he was looking at it with the expression of a man who had decided that when this was all resolved, he was going to throw it away properly, and that this seemed to me like exactly the right way to feel about it. Then I closed the log and started writing the Tirth Accord. I had been writing it in the back of my mind since the noodles went cold, as Savath sent his first formal report to the Velhari Confederation Council 3 days after the KTH Dominion lowered their weapons above Tirth 9. It was the longest document he had written in his diplomatic career, longer than his annual assessments, longer than the boundary negotiation briefings he had filed every quarter for the past 6 years, while the Keth expansion corridor inched closer to Velhari colonial space, and the Council responded with patience and carefully worded diplomatic protests. He sat at his desk for 4 hours writing it. He rewrote the opening 3 times. The problem was not a shortage of things to say. The problem was that what he had witnessed did not have a clean shape in diplomatic language. Diplomatic language was built for outcomes, for agreements reached in terms accepted and positions clarified. It was not particularly well suited for what he was trying to describe, which was the experience of watching a thing happen that permanently changed the size of several other things. In your mind, he kept coming back to the fleet, not the firepower, not the tactical outcome, though both of those would occupy the majority of his formal report. He kept coming back to the speed. 48 hours he had sat at the observation window and done the calculation, and the calculation kept producing the same result. 48 hours from a Tier 3 diplomatic inquiry to 67 ships and 4 carrier groups in full operational configuration above Tirth 9. The Keth Dominion had been present in Velhari colonial space for 9 months before the Tirth 9 situation reached the point that required a response. 9 months of incremental pressure, incremental positioning, incremental escalation, so carefully paced that each individual step was barely worth a formal protest. 48 hours, he wrote that down in the report and then looked at it for a while. The survivors from Tirth 9 were being processed through the temporary facilities that the UNISC medical teams had established on the orbital station. He had walked through those facilities twice, and both times he had been struck by the same thing. Not the efficiency, though the efficiency was remarkable. Not the scale of the operation, though that was also remarkable. It was the conversations the human medical personnel spoke to the Velhari survivors in a way that Esavath had not expected, not with the careful procedural courtesy of people performing a professional function, with the particular directness of people who were simply being present with another person in a difficult moment, asking ordinary questions about ordinary things, listening to the answers with complete attention. A doctor named Priamid who had been on the first medical ship to reach the dark transport sat with a group of children for 2 hours just talking about what their colony had been like, what the buildings looked like, what food grew there, what games they had played. She was not doing this for a clinical purpose. She was doing it because she wanted to know. Savathresh had stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. The Tirth Accord was signed. On the 4th day, he was present for the signing, so was Commander Oduya, who arrived for the ceremony in a uniform that had been pressed with military precision, but who was, Seth noticed, carrying a folder that appeared to have been compiled over a long period of time and was quite thick. She set it on the table without explanation and did not refer to it during the signing. The KE Dominion's representative, a senior diplomat named Kethvorl, arrived via shuttle from the K command ship, which was still holding position above Tirth 9, with its lights in the red configuration. Kethvorl was, Thresh understood, not a comfortable person to be at that particular moment. The Keth Dominion had not signed an agreement under these circumstances in 300 years. Their entire diplomatic tradition was structured around negotiating from a position of advantage. The apparatus of their foreign policy, built over centuries and 14 absorbed species, assumed that they would always be the larger party at the table. Commander Oduya placed the Tirth Accord on the table and sat down. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at Kethvorl with the expression of a person who had already thought through every relevant aspect of the situation and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Kethvorl said, "I would like to understand the basis for several of the Accord's provisions before signing." Odua opened the folder. She did not open it to find something. She opened it and placed her hand flat on the top document and said, "The basis for every provision in this Accord is documented in this folder. You are welcome to review any of it." Kethvorl looked at the folder. It was quite thick. He said, "The withdrawal timeline seems accelerated." Odua said it was generous given the circumstances. He said the reparation structure will be difficult to present to our governing council. She said, "Your governing council should have considered that before the atmospheric data looked the way it currently does." She said it without heat, without edge, in exactly the same tone that she had used to say the withdrawal timeline seems accelerated. It was a tone, as Savathresh had not heard used in a diplomatic signing in his career. Not cold, exactly, not aggressive, just true, just the flat, uncomplicated sound of a fact being stated by someone who had been documenting facts for long enough that stating them had become the most natural thing in the world. Kever was quiet for a moment. He signed the Accord. The signing ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Oduya was professional and courteous throughout it. She offered Kethvorl water. She thanked him for his time. She walked him to the shuttle bay herself, which was a gesture of diplomatic respect that Savathresh had not expected, and which appeared to confuse Kethvorl at least as much as it confused him. When she came back, Seth was still in the signing room. He had been trying to decide whether to say the thing he had been thinking about since the observation window. She sat down across from him and opened the folder again and began reviewing something in it. He said, "Commander." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to apologize for the fragment." She looked Up, he said, the internal communication, the one that said you grieved loudly and acted slowly. You were not meant to read that. She looked at him for a moment. She said, I know. He said it was not an accurate assessment. She said no. He waited to see if she would say anything else. She went back to the folder. He said, what made you bring so many ships? She did not look up immediately. She turned a page. Then she looked up and said, 37 million people had a festival scheduled. He sat. With that, she closed the folder. She said, the first human ships will begin withdrawal from orbit in 6 hours. By day 7, we will be down to a standard peacekeeping complement pending the verification timeline in the Accord. We will be completely out of your space by day 30 unless you request an extension. He said, and if we need you after day 30, she said, send a signal. He said, a Tier 3 inquiry. She looked at him. He was not certain in that moment whether the expression on her face was humor or something more serious. It was the kind of expression that was both things at once, the kind you only got on a face that had been carrying weight long enough that it had become structural. She said, any tear. She picked up the folder. She stood. She said, tell your council to schedule the festival. 7 cities is not all of them. Then she walked out. He sat alone in the signing room for a while after that. The Velhari child's drawing arrived on his desk that evening, forwarded from the general correspondence intake by his assistant, with a note that said non-essential. Personal message flagged for your attention. It had been sent to the UNISC fleet 3 days ago, just before the carrier groups began their withdrawal preparations. A drawing made by a child who had been on the dark transport with the 11% life support in the careful lines of someone who was still learning the coordination of hand and intention. Ships, many ships coming out of the dark. As Savath looked at the drawing for a long time, then he did something he had not done since he was a diplomat in his first posting, young and uncertain and convinced that the formal record was the only thing that mattered. He taped it to the wall. The KTH Dominion would spend the following years in a process they had never undergone before, not rebuilding exactly, reassessing their expansion corridor policies were revised, their military deployment protocols were restructured, their Foreign Relations Council commissioned a study which saves later obtained through diplomatic channels whose title translated as on the nature of human response capability and the implications for territorial policy. The study was thorough. It covered the speed of the mobilization, the fleet composition, the tactical outcomes, the documentation practices, the legal framework of the TER. It covered the communications culture of the UNISC fleet during engagement. It covered the medical operations and the signing ceremony and the withdrawal timeline. It was by any measure a serious and comprehensive document. Its conclusion was 2 sentences. The first sentence was a recommendation that the KE Dominion revise its threat assessment models to include a category that had previously been considered unnecessary. The second sentence was the category name. It translated as species that do not require a reason to come, only a signal that something is wrong. Commander Oduya received a copy of the study. She read it on the transit back to Meridian Station, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee that she actually finished while it was still warm, which was, she told Ellis Grant later. Personal record, she filed the study. The folder was very thick. Now, it had been archived in 3 separate databases, submitted to the diplomatic division and sent to Helen Cross with a note that said, "The paperwork is complete." Helen Cross sent back a single word: "thorough," on the last day of the full fleet presence. Above Turth 9, a message came through the general channel from the colony. Surface below, the atmospheric readings had improved enough in the past 3 days for some movement to resume in the surviving cities. Not normal movement. Not yet, but movement. The message was from the Velhari colonial administration, formal and carefully worded in the layered way of Hari official correspondence, and it reported that the festival, the one that had been scheduled and then gone unobserved, the ash and the silence, would be rescheduled for the coming season. It said, "We will leave a space in the ceremony for those who came when we could not ask loudly enough." Odwari. It at her desk, she did not tape it to the wall, she did not put it in the folder with the atmospheric data and the documentation and the Tariff Accord. She put it in a different place. Smaller folder, personal and unofficial, that did not have a label on it and lived in the bottom drawer of her desk. Rather than the formal filing system, it was the only thing in that folder. She closed the drawer. The KTH Dominion had spent years building a word for humanity, a word that meant small, unaware, not yet understood. That word had stopped being used in Keth diplomatic and military communication. Approximately 4 days after the fleet appeared above Turth 9, they were working on a new one. Savathresh knew this because the study said so in its opening paragraph. It said that existing KE vocabulary was insufficient for accurate categorization of human behavior and that the Foreign Relations Council had commissioned a linguistics working group to address the gap. Working group had been meeting for 6 months at the time of the study. They had not agreed on a word yet. As Savathresh thought he understood why. It was hard to put a word around something that had arrived in 48 hours. And then when the work was done, simply went home, not triumphant, not expansive, not changed in any visible way by what they had done, just home, ready presumably to eat cold noodles and answer the next signal and document the next folder and keep in the bottom drawer the small unofficial things that did not belong in any formal record, but that could not be thrown away. He looked at the drawing on his wall, ships coming out of the dark. He thought about what he would tell his assistant the next time a signal came in from human space. What category to file it under. He thought he would tell her not to bother. Some things did not fit in categories. Some things you just watched arrive.